Hello, everyone. I'm going to let a few folks trickle in here. Okay, a few of you have already joined. Welcome to our webinar today, COP30 and Fresh Energy, a discussion with J. Drake Hamilton. My name is Isaac. I'll be hosting the webinar today, but I'm just going to give it a minute or two as people join. Sometimes if you don't join Zoom calls often, it seems like every time you're about to join the webinar, Zoom wants to give you an update and it takes folks about 30 seconds or so to log in. So I just want to make sure people have a minute or two to come on, but thank you for being the early birds. I have opened up the chat, and so let me double check that everyone has permissions. Yes. So the chat is open. Feel free to drop your name and where you're joining us from today. We always like to see who's in the room. I know most of our audience is in Minnesota, but we do have folks from across the Midwest and the US who join us sometimes. So go ahead and leave your name and where you're joining us from today. And I hope you are enjoying the colder, snowier weather. Jay and I were talking about it this morning, how it's been kind of nice to have December start off with some real winter feeling weather. I was able to dust off my electric snowblower this past week to push some snow. And this seems like a group of folks that could appreciate a good electric snowblower. I would give it a strong recommendation if you have not made the switch yet, or if you were like me and you used to be shoveling snow instead of using any snowblower. I can attest that the electric ones are really great. But with that, we've been here for about a few minutes now, so I think that we are going to officially kick things off. All right. Welcome, everybody, to Fresh Energy's webinar, COP30 and Fresh Energy, Discussions with J. Drake Hamilton. This is Jay's 10th time covering the UN's annual Global Climate Conference, and today's webinar is going to debrief what happened and what it means for our fight against climate change. This year, Jay, like many others, attended virtually, and she's going to discuss what happened, and then we can pepper her with questions at the end while she's still fresh off the conference. To give you a bit of an overview of the webinar today, Jay will be speaking for the first 45 minutes about her COP30 experience, and then we'll hold 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for Jay to answer your questions. I do want to do a bit of housekeeping first before we start. First, we are recording today's webinar, and a link to the recording will automatically be sent to everyone's email who registered. You'll be getting that email from me either later today or tomorrow. And we will also be publishing the audio from today's webinar to our podcast, Decarbonize the Clean Energy Podcast. If you aren't already a subscriber, I would encourage you to open up your favorite podcasting app and search for us and go ahead and subscribe. My last episode was with Eric about building codes and climate change. It was a really great episode, so I would encourage you all to subscribe. Second, a few of you have submitted questions prior to today's webinar, and thank you for doing that. But as I said before, we'll hold the last 15 minutes for your questions, but you can use the handy dandy Q&A button on your Zoom screen at any part of today's webinar to ask a question. It should be just a little button at the bottom of your screen, and I think you should be able to see other folks' questions as well. So you can upvote ones that you would like Jay to answer. Please try to use the Q&A instead of the chat. It just helps us keep those things a little separate, makes it easier for us when we get to that portion. And third, for those of you who just joined us, feel free to leave your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. Okay. For those of you who are new to Fresh Energy, I'm going to give you a quick scoop on who we are and what we do. Fresh Energy has been working on clean energy and climate policy issues here in Minnesota and throughout the Midwest for over 30 years. We are changing the world through bold policy solutions that move us to a just, carbon-free future. And we're helping everyone who lives here end their dependence on fossil fuels, electrify their lives, and build a healthy, clean energy economy where all can thrive. Okay, let's move on to introductions. So you have been hearing from me. My name is Isaac Quam. I am the senior writer and editor on the communications team. And I am joined by Jay, who is the star of our show today. Jay is the managing director of science policy here at Fresh Energy. Jay, do you want to give a small introduction to the folks on the webinar?
Hello, everyone. I know a lot of you on the call, and I hope to meet all of you. I'm Jay. I go by Jay. I'm one of the seasoned employees of Fresh Energy. I've now been here 29 years. So I know a lot about energy and climate policy. Now I specialize on decarbonizing everything. And one of the small things I do is I go to international conferences. But I wanted to let you know that I've also been appointed by Governor Walz to serve on his advisory council on climate change. There are 15 of us from around Minnesota. I'm one of the 15. We serve 4-year terms, and the governor has been clear with us. He wants us to tell him, to recommend to him, what are the next best steps he could take on climate action. And what he's interested in is things that are going to benefit everyone in the state and that are going to reduce big slugs of carbon emissions first. So, I'm going to be talking today about COP30. Um, and if we could go to the first slide, I think. Isaac, thanks. All right. So, COP30 was held in Belem, Brazil. And I had Isaac pull up this map because many people don't know where Belem is. Belem is at the mouth or one of the mouths of the Amazon River where it enters the Atlantic Ocean. And it is very much in Amazonia. And it was selected from all cities that President Lula, who's the leader of Brazil, could choose because he wanted people to see one of the not superstars yet of Brazil, to see where people just got air conditioning recently. Um, so that's why I picked Belém. But I want to point out to you, Brazil is such a huge country that I was not too startled, but a little dissettled when I found, when I was joining virtually, that many of the world leaders joined COP30, which is held in Belém, and they never set foot in Belém because Belém started on November 10th and ran through the 22nd of November. And the World Leaders Summit was actually held before this on November 6th and 7th, and it was held in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. And those are respectively 1,785 miles from Belém and 1,977 miles from Belém. That is like equivalent to New York and LA. So it's a very big country. I was there for the 30th Conference of Parties, or the COP30, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is always called UNFCCC. And the UNFCCC is a treaty that was first written in 1992 at Rio de Janeiro. So it was like coming back to the place where the Earth Summit was held. And global attention was turned to the annual climate conference as people from almost 200 nations assessed climate progress, and they were all being very real about the gaping action or lack of action that remains and the actions that must now be taken very swiftly. People were all interested in implementing solutions and talking about solutions that were working in their countries, and people were ready to negotiate new commitments. So Fresh Energy always looks for climate science to greatly influence climate diplomacy. And we know that perhaps as many as 3.45 billion people worldwide are highly vulnerable to the climate crisis. So the time to act is now, and it is to be decisive. Now, I did not plan to be at side events, as I am much more interested in watching diplomacy at work, in watching how parties who are the leaders of countries, the negotiators, present their solutions to the rest of the COP and pose questions to the UN. So I'm particularly interested in attending plenary sessions with 1,000 to 2,000 people in the room. And because I had the ticket to the virtual platform, I was on at the same time with like 10,000 people from around the world. We could hear everything perfectly. So it was really an easy way to attend. Um, so I want to tell you a little bit about the importance of this COP and what it can do. First of all, it was asking, is the Paris Agreement that was struck in 2015, is it working? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. Um, and the agreement is putting forward more aggressive, nationally determined contributions, and finance is vastly ramping up. However, the world is not decarbonizing fast enough. Before the Paris Agreement, um, the globe was aimed at reaching another 4 degrees Celsius rise by 2100. But now, if all businesses did all of what is promised, that warming would be cut to only 1.8 degrees Celsius, which is still too much. So, in COP21 in Paris, countries promised to curtail emissions to ensure that the rise in global temperature stays well below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue efforts to keep that temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius. From the start, the UNFCCC process was fraught with challenges. One roadblock is procedural, in that every decision at a COP has to be made by consensus rather than by supermajority. Each country's vote carries the same weight, giving unprecedented power to vulnerable and poor countries, which is the intention. And while this could be seen as usually beneficial, it could it also gave any one country, they're called parties, the ability to block an agreement the rest of the world favored. That is, it creates an escape clause that countries with fossil fuel and other special interests could use to limit ambition and slow progress. But what I noticed time and time again is it was very rare for a country to block that. So in Paris, 10 years ago, a remarkable thing happened in a temporary conference hall at a former airport on the outskirts of Paris. After years of bitter negotiations, the leaders of nearly every country agreed to try to slow down global warming in an effort to head off its most devastating effects. So, the core idea was that countries would set their own targets to reduce their climate pollution in ways that make sense to them. Rich industrialized countries were expected to go fastest and to help lower income countries pay for the changes they needed to cope with climate hazards that are already happening. So, every country remains committed to the Paris Agreement except one, and that's the United States. We can talk about that later if you'd like to. Um, like most things in life worth having, COP is work. Yes, it can be disappointing, dysfunctional, even maddening at times. I've seen all these things. In 2025, 10 years after the promising outcome of COP21 in Paris, the most consequential COP so far, the world has now trimmed expecting warming trajectory from 4 degrees down to 2.6 degrees warming by 2100. It is clearly not enough, but at some level, COP is working. We just need to make it work faster. It's not whether Paris is or isn't a failure. It's whether countries are failing their commitments to the Paris Agreement. So, as part of COP21, countries had all agreed to step up their climate action in a 5-year review cycle. So, for example, when world leaders, and I was one of those, came together in Glasgow. Um, it was the first, and this was in 2021, it was the first step of a crucial test whether the Paris Agreement would be anything more than empty rhetoric. So let's look at the decision texts. That is the document that is single spaced. Sometimes they're as short as 15 pages, sometimes they're as long as 40 pages. But remember, every line has to be approved by every one of nearly 200 countries by consensus. So the decision text that came out of the 2021 meeting in Glasgow was the first time coal was mentioned in the text, as nations agreed to phase down unabated coal power. That was historic. At COP23, countries responding to the global stocktake report by making their first collective promise and toward leaving fossil fuels in the past. A year-long effort by the United Arab Emirates, the president of that, which was held at COP28 in Dubai, resulted in all delegates agreeing to transition the world away from fossil fuels. Another big historic outcome. So the global stocktake report that they also finalized in Dubai was unequivocal on what we must do to create a safe future. And now we need to figure out how to use COPs to make sure this actually happens. So today, COP remains essential. It is the only forum in the world that gives equal voice to countries, rich and poor, to negotiate responsibilities on addressing climate change. We know that now the direction of emissions is right. It is going down, but the speed isn't right yet. So the big question for COP30 was, is the world ready to accelerate climate action and build a system that is fit for the future we want?
And Jay, I know as you were just saying, COP gives all countries an equal voice in addressing climate change. And I know from reading your daily blog this year that there were quite a few different kind of groups of countries at COP30 this year. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and I was fascinated by this because it was my first time really stepping back, especially because the US was largely not there, and see who else was there. And there are really three big groups. The first is high-income countries. And we know that this group is primarily tasked by the US with decarbonizing, the UN, with decarbonizing their economies and doing their part of reaching our goal of achieving no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. Some examples of these high-income countries include the US, Sweden, the UK, Denmark, and many others. The second group is was foremost at Belem. This is the vulnerable and lower income countries. Examples abound: Somalia, Ethiopia, Yemen, Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Marshall Islands, and the other small island developing states. The third group was perhaps the most interesting. It is the large middle income countries, and they are trying to decarbonize while accelerating green economic growth. And the bit you will recognize all of these examples. Brazil, our host, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Colombia, and South Africa. And I'm going to get back to these countries when we talk about what came out of Belem.
And I know as these countries came together to negotiate this year, the big topic was the new national climate plans that were unveiled. Can you talk a little bit about what those national climate plans were?
Yeah, the reason to the way to think about the national climate plans, it's a better name than the nationally determined contributions. But that was a name that came out of when the UN negotiators were trying to trying to allow space, lots of space, for the COP, um, the COP solutions to be implemented by countries working in their political systems. Okay? So that's going on. So when we track new national climate plans to the Paris Agreement goals, we knew even before Belem was convened, we knew that the NDCs did not add up to what we need, not nearly close. But listen to this. Here we're now a couple of days after COP has closed, and now 121 countries who represent 74% of global emissions have submitted new national climate plans. So collectively, although they control like 74% of globe's emissions, these deliver less than 15% of the emissions reductions required by 2035 to limit global temperature to 1.5 degrees C. So they're not good enough. UN analysis finds that the world remains on course for a warming by 2100 of between 2.3 and 2.8 degrees Celsius. So that doesn't cut it. Many civil organizations and countries are urging COP30 to encourage countries to update their long-term climate strategies to better catalyze more ambitious action. Instead, the final COP30 outcome launched two voluntary initiatives, and they will report progress before COP31 in 2026, and I'll talk about those later. So, for the first time at this COP, negotiators acknowledged the strong likelihood that the world will overshoot 1.5 degrees C and needs to limit the overshoot in its magnitude and its duration. We have to keep it as short as possible before it's corrected, and we can't let it get too big. So at COP30, there were unprecedented numbers of references to transitioning away from all fossil fuels in energy systems. Now, I was watching a lot of webinars and podcasts before COP, and I knew that transitioning away from fossil fuels would not be the number one course of action at the COP. But it came up a lot during the second week. And we knew that it was necessary to accelerate ambitious economy-wide emissions reductions targets. But what we found that since 2023, renewables deployed by 2030 must triple. And we're already on this path. Isn't that great? And we put ourselves on the path in 2023 of doubling energy efficiency also by 2030.
Think we're really at a point now where the renewables that are being built at such a rapid scale, not just because they're clean and we need to meet those climate targets, but also because they're increasingly becoming our cheapest source of power. We've talked a lot about that in past blog posts and webinars we've done, but I think that the speed that solar and wind are being built, along with batteries helping us use more wind and solar more often, is really changing the trajectory of how we're meeting those goals. Can you tell us a little bit, Jay, about how fast wind, solar, and batteries are being built?
Well, I'll tell you something I heard just a few days ago out of India. India announced that it had recently overtook Germany to become the world's third largest producer of renewable power. Did anyone on this call know that? I hadn't known that. So Germany is a big, very important renewable producer, and now they've been overtaken by India. That's why I was very interested in these middle-sized but growing economies in the world. And that's why I paid a lot of attention to what they had to say. But now we're finding remarkable things happening, especially with solar, with battery storage, and also with wind. So in the first half of 2025, renewables overtook coal in global power production. Historic. Solar is spreading faster than we thought it would. Not we, just us at Fresh Energy, but even people at the International Energy Agency. They didn't know it would happen so fast. Solar costs have fallen tremendously. The cost of financing for solar has declined rapidly, and the scale of manufacturing is cheaper and much bigger. The real economy's investments in renewables, even after the election of President Trump, continue apace. Since 2015, solar and wind's share of electricity production has more than tripled. That means we met the first really important goal of the Paris Agreement, to show that we can do this. Solar power is the fastest growing source of electricity in history, repeatedly exceeding projections for future increase in installed capacity and in generation. As soon as next year, it is estimated renewables will be the world's largest source of electricity. The US has seen remarkable growth in solar energy and storage. So look at 2 points in time. In 2017, the US had, and write this down, 35 gigawatts of solar. So 35 GW of solar and storage. Just 8 years later, in October 2025, the US had 255 gigawatts of solar and storage. That is an increase of 543% in 9 years. That's historic, amazing, and is really a stiff wind at our backs. It's due to significant cost reductions because of market adoption and advances in manufacturing. So solar plus storage, for example, has recently been outcompeting fossil fuels. It's projected that solar plus storage will account for 85% of new energy construction in 2025, this year. No one ever thought this would happen this quickly, and we're very lucky. Solar and wind, however, need to grow at 29% per year each, solar and wind, until 2030. So that is a big gap that needs to be filled. One thing that was important in all the negotiations I watched was the nearly complete absence of the United States. The United States effectively boycotted the annual gathering. Just like a few days later, they boycotted the G20 finance gathering in South Africa. It was the first time in 30 years of climate talks, 30 years, that the U.S. had not attended. So the U.S. was not there to push a number of negotiators. They weren't there to especially push China to take leadership action. China played a limited role in Belem. They didn't even send President Xi. And they were like the U.S. who didn't send our president, or he chose not to go. And the president of India also did not go. And China chose not to step into the leadership vacuum left by this U.S. boycott. China avoided taking strong positions on all of the main sticking points of the talks. Also, a whole group of seasoned, smart diplomats, mostly Americans, were not present. For example, a country like the UK sent a very large negotiation delegation. They sent about 70 negotiators to Belem. Many world leaders and business executives especially those from American companies, skipped the 2030 proceedings. And that was a big problem.
And I think that was kind of a bigger difference from this year's COP conference compared to last year's. For the parties that were present at COP30 this year, Jay, what sort of climate progress were they able to make for the countries that were there?
Yeah, COP30 delivered on two things, forests and finance, but they undelivered on fossil fuels. No new pledges were made at COP30 to cut fossil fuels, none. Uruguay and many other parties I listened to objected to the report that was coming out of COP, and the president of COP was obliged to suspend discussions on, on the last day for 30 to 40 minutes to try to calm people down and to get them to agree that he could go ahead. Because the text that he was presenting to negotiators contained no mention of a fossil fuel phase out roadmap that many countries were asking for. So, what happened in the lead up to Belem is that 78 advisors from around the world put in almost a year of work and they designed 159 different indicators, emissions indicators, health indicators, water indicators, which quickly in Belem were reduced to only half as many indicators. So, what had happened to all this work? Many countries were asking that question. Many indicators were modified, were made unclear, were no longer usable, or were unmeasurable. So, if things are not measurable, you can't track them, you can't achieve them. The EU said in public, we cannot accept the text presented to us in its current form. The EU. They said the Paris Agreement calls for adaptations to a safer, more resilient future for the poorest people. And that's what it does say. The negotiator from Panama, Juan Carlos Gomez, said a climate decision, which is what the president was proposing, that can't even state fossil fuels is not neutrality. He said it is complicity. And what is happening here transcends incompetence. These are his words. Science has been deleted from COP30 because it offends the polluters. And the final text was not discussed in person. So that is why the president of COP had to suspend the discussions for 30 or 40 minutes. Now, meanwhile, the United Nations Executive Secretary, Simon Steele, said, well, look, here we have 194, maybe 195 countries who have said in one voice, the first time I ever heard that agreement, that, quote, the Paris Agreement is working, and they resolved to make it go further and faster. These are historic things, and it is important that this was said. COP30 showed that climate cooperation is alive and kicking. A case in point, they developed an action agenda, which includes 117 plans, detailed plans to accelerate solutions, which is important. So, the key outcomes agreed to at the climate talks in Belem were announced by President Andre Correa do Lago, who's the president of COP30. And he voiced that he wanted to adopt the outcomes of the agenda items on his screen. And 195 parties agreed to at least triple adaptation finance for developing nations by 2030. Particularly, this was money that will come from the EU, the UK, Japan, and other rich countries. and new efforts to strengthen climate targets. Triple the money will be given to developing countries to help them withstand weather events. So parties knew they needed a deal to help speed up climate action. The chair of the least developed countries group, whose name is Evans Gemma, and he comes out of Malawi, East Africa, he said, adaptive funding was the most important thing to our least developed countries group. This was our priority, and we made it a red line. So they made sure that the UK, EU, Japan, and others are required to provide the funding. What worked was that the least developed countries and another bloc, and there's dozens of blocs at COPs. Another one is called the Africa Group. They have some of the same member countries, but these two groups combined forces at COP30. They planned ahead and they said, we are going to agree to align. That means we're not going to mirror each other 100%. We are going to align together to push for more adaptive financing to be decided in Belem. Their strategy paid off. That is, they had a mega coalition pushing, especially at the EU, UK, and Japan, and they now got a legal responsibility in the document under the agreement. That means this is subject to courts to make sure that this happens. I was listening closely to a lot of the negotiating leads from the poorer countries, and I was very impressed with all of them. They all stuck to their time limits, which is something I've never seen even the US do. They talked really quickly, but they knew what they wanted to say. One of these people was a woman named Ilana Said. She is the Palau ambassador to the UN. She chaired the coalition of small island nations. She said, it was better what we got, this increased, at least tripled climate finance for adaptation. Better that we didn't get a decision. It's for more funding for adaptation. Colombia's ambassador, another woman, Daniela Duran Gonzalez, she pointed out to the president before he was required to suspend the negotiations. She said, Mr. President, this you've called the COP of the truth. The truth cannot support an outcome that ignores the science. She and many others said that the summit leaders had ignored their concerns before approving the deal. But what was actually going on was that the COP president was working on another option. He knew that we needed roadmaps so humanity can, one, overcome reliance on fossil fuels and transition away from those fossil fuels by creating roadmaps that were called, look for these letters, capital T, capital A, capital F, transition away from fossil fuels. He said, we need a roadmap for that. And secondly, we need a roadmap to halt and reverse deforestation. So there was a confused and contradictory story. And this was created by the many blocs, which have overlapping groups of countries. And the countries are listed as both supporting and opposing the idea of including a fossil fuel roadmap in the COP outcome. Some of the countries that are on both lists supporting a fossil fuel roadmap, some supporting it, and then some also say they're opposing it. They include countries like Bahrain, Czech Republic, Cuba, Haiti, Nepal, Sierra Leone, Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu. Many of the LDCs had opposed a roadmap, and these two negotiating blocs held their opposition for different reasons. Now, what was widely reported was that as many as 80, sometimes as many as 90 countries, so at least a little under half of those present, stood their ground for a fair and equitable shift off fossil fuel. But they said that an intense lobbying from a few petrostates weakened the deal. And if you look at who were the biggest blockers of the deal, they indeed were countries, Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, India. But that was only 80 or 90 countries. And remember, there are like 194, 195 countries at Belem. So not even half of them. So in closed doors negotiations, we heard that the COP president had said, well, look, we have 80 countries who were for developing a roadmap for moving off quickly off fossil fuels, but 80 are against it. And some of the less developed countries publicly backed a fossil fuel roadmap and others did not. Some countries are members of both the Alliance for Small Island States and also less developed countries. But many delegates from the Global South disagreed, citing concerns about likely sudden economic contraction and heightened social stability with moving too quickly off of fossil fuels. These were not fossil fuel owners. So there was a very big split. But really, what had come up with and was proposed, what was launched by the Brazilian COP30 president and together with the Brazilian President Lula, they said, I, as the president of COP30, will therefore create two roadmaps, one on halting and reversing deforestation, another to transition away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. They will be led by science and they will be inclusive. We will convene high-level dialogues, gather key international organizations, governments from both producing and consuming countries, industry workers, scholars, civil society, and will report back to the COP in April 2026 in Colombia. And Colombia and the Netherlands will lead and host this first ever conference. And they'll be doing it in time to have people plan for COP31, which will be held in Turkey. And they have from April 2026 till November 2026 to come up with the details of the roadmap.
And aside from countries, I know a kind of a major trend this year was a lot more local and regional governments that were present and active at COP30 this year. I know for folks that were maybe following COP and just following headlines, you maybe knew that the federal government was boycotting COP. But what you might not know is that there were still quite a few groups representing our country at COP this year. Jay, can you tell us about a little more about local governments at COP30 this year?
Well, the UN COP30 also made major efforts to unite people from 14,000 local governments from around the world, regional governments and national governments around climate action. The COP president is credited for getting, get this, a first ever 3,500 indigenous people registered and in person at COP30. And they spoke, they were eloquent, they were effective. And so COP30 elevated the voices of indigenous people like never before. I was watching it enthralled and very pleased. So when 195 parties approved the Belem package, that showed that multilateralism can accelerate climate actions that benefit people. At first glance, COP today looks like brutal negotiation among countries. But if you pull back the curtain, you will see strong coalitions being built in Africa, in small island states, and across both of those together in some cases, and then working in alignment to get a big victory at Belem. So a lot of the leadership I saw in Belem comes from far beyond only the white rich countries in the global north. And it was great to see. What I saw coming from the US was a strong presence from America is All In, and I recommend you go to their website, America is All In, one word, and the US Climate Alliance. So 122 Minnesota entities belong to the US Climate Alliance, which has presence in all 50 states with 63% of the US population and 74% of the US GDP. Thus, it is the non-federal climate movement, and it was at Belem. It shows the breaking of possibility in Belem. America's All In was funded in fall 2024 by billionaire Michael Bloomberg, which allowed the U.S. in December 2024 to file the U.S.'s updated NDC. It's their climate plan. So it's a big deal. AI, as it's called, is a very large collaborative, including Minnesota companies, including 3M, Cargill, Best Buy, General Mills, Health Partners, Darcy Solutions, Target Corporation, and Fresh Energy. Six Minnesota companies, six Minnesota cities, Duluth, Eden Prairie, Minneapolis, Minnetonka, Rochester, and the St. Paul. And a critical member is Governor Walz from the state of Minnesota. So, what happened in Belem is that there were a number of people, a small number of people, like including Governor Gavin Newsom from California, who was about at half the COP, and he was there for the week one, and he spoke about how California has now become the fourth largest economy in the world. And he talked mostly about California, so that was not his strongest point. I think he should have talked more about the rest of the country. We had one U.S. Senator at Belem, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who represents Rhode Island. And he said, we have a system of federalism in the U.S. under the rule of law. But he said, I'm the only U.S. Senator in COP30. And President Trump refused to facilitate his trip. His badge, he held it up, his badge at COP was as an observer. He didn't even get to go as a senator. Um, and we heard from a lot of representatives, former ambassadors, who now are working for places like the University of Maryland, describing what Maryland is doing. A former representative from the U.S. Department of State, he was representing the same 2/3 of the U.S. population and 3/4 of the GDP. They reminded the audiences that we have a federalized constitution, so state and local leaders have lots of policy authority. States primarily determine energy policy, not primarily the federal government. And states primarily control building codes and energy codes. And local governments do the vast amount of EV charging. So one of the other members who comes from the Port of Seattle, he was in Belem, and he said, the Port of Seattle has a goal of net zero by 2040, and it was never driven by the federal government. And he said to the people in the room, Americans, he said, real work has always been done faster at the subnational state level. And he said, almost in caps, because I wrote it in caps, because it sounded like it should be, he said, your work in the U.S. at the state and regional level makes a difference. So please continue working together, learning together, communicating with each other, and creating solutions together. And that was a good set of set of remarks from a number of important Americans at Belem.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you for walking us through everything that happened at COP30. And I think that's a really good testament to the important work that Fresh Energy does. So much of our work is at the state level, which is, of course, where so much of the climate action actually happens.
Mhm.
We are now going to shift into the Q&A section of our webinar. For folks that haven't submitted a Q&A yet or a question yet, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Before we dive into that, I'm going to give Jay just a chance to grab a drink of water or something. She's been talking for quite a while here. And I am going to plug a few things before we get into questions. And the first is our upcoming webinar. If you are watching today's webinar and you feel like you've caught the webinar bug and can't wait to join Fresh Energy for our next one, I have great news because our next one is Monday, December 8th from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. And it is all about innovative financing for clean energy projects. So we've got my coworker, John Vaughn, will be hosting it. It will be a virtual conversation with a few of our partners, Community Reinvestment Fund, Sunrise Banks, and the Minnesota Climate Innovation Finance Authority, kind of informally known as Minnesota's Green Bank. They will be talking all about clean energy financing next Monday. I've also got a blog post forthcoming with the Minnesota Climate Innovation Finance Authority. So keep your eyes on the blog this month for that. But tune in for this webinar next Monday to learn how Minnesotans are adapting to federal changes to keep planning and building clean energy projects. And finally, you can also stay connected with Fresh Energy by joining our Powering Progress newsletter. Feel free to scan the QR code on your screen now to stay up to date with our work. On this newsletter, we're really sharing everything that's important for you to know about Fresh Energy, from sharing webinars like this conversation with Jay today to about 10 or so blog posts a month. Mainly, a lot of those are written by yours truly, as well as Fresh Energy staff. We also share in-person events and much, much more for climate action that's happening in Minnesota. So scan the QR code on your screen now to join our list. And you can also sign up anytime at fresh-energy.org/subscribe to join. Okay, that is enough from me. I'm going to stop sharing and dive into our Q&A. We haven't had a whole lot of folks ask questions that are here today, but we did get a few pre-submitted questions beforehand. And the first one I want to ask you about, Jay, is a question we had from Lisa. Let me pull it up here. Lisa says that she understands that the Colombian government is leading the way by joining together 80 countries in a non-proliferation of fossil fuels agreement. And she's interested in hearing more about this and what other hopeful signs you gathered from COP30 this year.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, I hear a lot about these 80 countries, but remember the examples I gave you of at least as many, the same number of countries who are really in Belem after an allied position of working to get climate finance for developing countries who are now suffering from weather caused by climate change. And they were successful in tripling the amount that will be spent by the bigger, richer countries. And all of it will go, beginning in 2035, toward adapting and building resilience. So many of these countries were less developed countries. Many of them were island countries. So if you have the same number of countries, and there's still some countries that we haven't even heard about, right? And when I mentioned to you that now 121 new nationally determined contributions, new national climate plans who have been submitted, and that adds up to 75, almost 75% of global emissions. But maybe someone has asked, what were the countries who did not submit a new climate plan? It was 76 countries who represent 26% of emissions. So they are really derelict in their responsibility as signers of this UNFCCC. I think what happened in Belem is back in Dubai in 2023, everyone there, everyone agreed we needed to find a way to transition away from fossil fuels. But we needed a lot longer than 2 weeks to work out a roadmap. So it's very good now that Colombia and the Netherlands are going to host a conference that will be held in April, and they're working on it now because they have to come out of that conference. Mostly, they have to bring to the conference a proposed roadmap, and then they have to convince the rest of the world that this is the right roadmap and do it under consensus too. And then they can need to take it to the next COP, which is COP31 in Turkey. Um, so everyone was talking about this the second week of COP. They were talking about halting and reversing deforestation because they were in Brazil. They knew. And they wanted to talk about finding a way to, in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, which is what the UN language says, for this transition away from fossil fuels. We haven't yet done that work. So the presidency of Belem is still the president until COP31. And they are going to be working, I think, their asses off, trying to make sure that they produce a text that can be put in front of people at the international conference to say what could be better about it. How would we improve this? How would we make it more just, more orderly, and more equitable? So there's still lots of work to do. Stay tuned for COP31. And remember what I said to start off. COPs are really important, and there's no substitute. There is no substitute for this process. It has its weak points, but it is the most comprehensive and the most fair in that every country gets a vote. And that's very important.
Our next question is from Jason, who I think must have been following your daily blog, and he's asking what your experience was, Jay, following COP30 negotiations this year, especially from negotiators from less developed countries.
They were amazing. I listened to them because I was able to do it from home, and I had perfect sound, and I could look at the people, and they were all they jumped to their points very well. They didn't rush them, but they usually were given 5 minutes to speak from each country. And then they could come back up again. And someone got in the queue again. I was so impressed. I was first impressed with so many very different countries from South America that were agreeing with each other. So places that I'd never heard from before, like Paraguay, Uruguay, Colombia, even Argentina was agreeing with them on some things. And this is, I think, what we're hoping for, what the UN has tried to build, to be able to give people who are far away from the richest countries, who are the most vulnerable to the climate change, to give them a microphone and to have enough of them and to have them to be able to prepare themselves really well. That's what I saw in spades at Belem. And it was very nice to hear. Very great. Made me very proud.
We have about 1 minute left, but I do see two open questions. So I'm going to go through those two questions. But first, I do want to respect people's time. So if you have to drop off here at 1 o'clock, of course, feel free. You will be receiving an email from me either today or tomorrow with a link to the recording of today's webinar if you want to tune in more later. We'll also be posting it to YouTube as well as the audio from today's webinar to our podcast. So for those of you that need to drop, you will be getting an email from me with a link to the recording today. But for folks that can stay on for a few more minutes, I want to get to Susie and Stephen's questions. So Susie is asking, Jay, what did the 3,500 Indigenous people wish for? Were they included in negotiations and decisions? And are they included in receiving funding to adapt and build resilience as smaller island countries?
Yes, I saw a lot of different, not only plenary group discussions, but smaller breakout discussions where Indigenous leaders from all over the world were speaking, were being listened to, were being given the same time limits as everyone else in the room, and had the microphone. And I got to hear from people I've never heard their voices before. And this was because of the president of COP made that happen. That was maybe its biggest victory. But many of those people were saying, we are at the forefront. We are already experiencing climate change, and we need some money from richer countries to help us adapt to these very big, very grievous changes to our lifestyle and our own and the existence of our country too. So it was very great to hear from those people.
And our last question is from Stephen. He has a few questions, but I'll kind of lump them together. And he's wondering if it will be enough, if there will be enough, will there be enough renewable and energy efficiency to satisfy all future electricity needs? And he's wondering if fossil and nuclear are threatening renewable and efficiency as well.
Well, remember what I said about solar and wind. They have to each grow by 29% a year by 2030. That's a really big change. But what's good is that solar plus storage are going to provide about 85% of the energy production on the globe in 2025. So things are lined up behind us, but we need to keep pushing forward faster and more aggressively.
Thanks, Jay. I think that's a great place to leave it. I want to thank everyone for joining our webinar today. And as I said just a few moments ago, you will be receiving an email from me later today with a link to today's recording and other information, both on YouTube and on our podcast, Decarbonize the Clean Energy Podcast. I want to thank Jay for answering all of our questions and walking us through the complete debrief about COP30. And I also want to thank all of you for joining us today. With that, I'm going to end today's webinar. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and have a great rest of your day.